I am writing a book. I am walking something called the Cornish Celtic Way and writing a book about both my experiences of that walk, but also some of the ancient wisdom that that landscape holds. And to help me do that, I am inviting people to join me for sections of that walk and sort of interviewing them very informally as we walk. One of the people I have interviewed is the brilliant Sophie Austin, who is a multidisciplinary storyteller working across theatre, film, audio, and she is also somebody who is just a very interested and interesting human. She challenged me to walk the section of the coast path that she joined me for at night in the dark. And the conversation that we had on that day was so magical that I couldn't wait for the book to share it with you. So I wanted to invite her onto the podcast for a slightly different conversation, but one that nonetheless captures some of her magic. So I hope you really enjoy it. I'm sure you will. Sophie, welcome to Brackish. Perhaps you could start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do and how you came to do what you do.
Thank you, Katie, and I am so delighted to be here. So my name is Sophie, and I am a multidisciplinary artist. So I'm a theatre director, a filmmaker, a producer, a writer, and I work across theatre, film, and audio, telling stories that cover kind of social justice and environmental issues and give voice to the marginalized, both human and non-human. I didn't always do that. I think I have kind of coined or termed myself as a wild storyteller more recently, which covers this idea that I want to sort of really bring to life the wildness in us and in the wilder world, and bring about that sort of connection through story. But I started out life, I guess, as a theatre maker, and I ran a theatre company for a while, which was 15 years of my life creating theatre anywhere but theatres, so up and down high streets, in shopping centres, supermarkets, people's houses, parks and forests. And these stories were often classic texts or classic ideas, from sort of a play about tango to Shakespeare to Chekhov to Brecht. But we always did a different spin on it. So the idea was that you think you know this story, but let's tell you in a different way. And often they were interactive and immersive. So you were invited to become part of the story and be a collaborator and play with us as we took you on a journey. And it was one of the happiest times of my life to be running down a high street with an audience, often split into 3 or 4 different groups, being various characters from the Odyssey or whatever. And then I stopped doing that just before the pandemic. Actually, I kind of sort of got to the end of I'd been working at it sort of full time for a long time, whilst also having quite a successful career as a director elsewhere in theatres, I suppose. And I was burnt out, I think, and just a bit, I put all my heart and soul into it, and I struggled sometimes to find a balance, I guess. And so miraculously, somehow the dice rolled and I became pregnant. And so I realized that I couldn't have 2 babies at once. And so I gave up my theatre baby and concentrated on my new baby, my human baby. And in so doing, he then brought into my world this whole sort of other way of telling stories and experiencing nature and the environment. And I think through his box fresh eye, straight out of the womb eyes, I was able to see the world for what it was and what it is in a way that I hadn't before. And I suddenly realized that actually this is the story that I want to tell now. And this is who I want to tell it for, and how I want to tell it through this sort of awe and wonder that Rudy sort of shared with me. And so then I started working out what different formats to tell this story. So rather than sort of focusing on one art form, I thought that the most important thing is to diversify the story that I'm telling in order to reach, or to diversify the mediums that I'm using to tell the story in order to reach a wider audience, and to, share this story for my mum and for my sister, but also for you and for my husband and for, you know, anyone, but in different ways. And so that's what I've been doing. And it has been a sort of the biggest privilege of my life, I think, to sort of go down this road and change tact in a way that has, you know, felt really true to me and really sort of invested in my authentic kind of self, I guess.
Mm. Nice, I love that, and I love the term wild storyteller. There's kind of so many different ways to interpret the word wild, and I think they all fit.
Very, very true.
So, as an example of the new ways in which you're telling stories, we connected via the Bioleadership Project, which we're both fellows of. But we met in person for the first time when I invited you to join me for a coast path walk as part of the book I'm writing at the moment. And your response was, sure, but can we do it in the dark? Why, Sophie, why?
I love how we met. And I think one of my biggest sort of passions is finding ways to meet people in connection in a way that allows us both to meet something new. And but yeah, so I guess I have been walking in the dark for a while as a way of kind of meeting. And so I'm based in London, and I live obviously in a sort of built up massive city, but there is a lot of wildness here. And to access the wild, I found walking at night to be a really sort of powerful way to see our environment in a new way. And so the invitation when you invited me to come on a walk with you was to consider whether we could see the Cornish coast in a new way for you, and to explore what darkness brings to that wild place. Obviously, you know, I'm writing this response to you in September, probably in my little house in sunny Peckham, you know, and then it gets closer to the time and I'm like, oh yeah, we're meeting in February on a coastline that I don't know at all, really. And I kept looking, I did the Google map thing, and you know, oh yeah, it's quite close to the edge, that path. Yep. And I think we'd had quite a bad storm the week before. And so it was just like, wow, is this mad? But what your response was, yes, let's absolutely do it. And again, that for me is one of the most beautiful things about the sort of the way I work and the stories that I want to tell is the yes and response from the people that I work with or collaborate with or the audiences that I meet. Yes, where can we go next? How can we take this in a different way? And you had exactly that. So it felt to me, right, if you'd come back to me and gone, actually, you know what? I'm terrified of the dark and I've got anxiety and I find all this rather stressful, I would have gone, okay, fine, well, we'll just go in the daylight. But you didn't, whether you had those feelings or not. You were like, no, let's do it. And and that to me is just like, okay, excellent. And I love that sort of trust that we put in each other.
Yeah. And we should say to anybody listening that there was a part that went very close to the edge, and we did that bit in daylight because it would have been bordering on foolish not to. And by the time the sun set, we were a little bit inland and on wide paths and kind of, yeah, on the edge of that fear and wildness, but not foolishly endangering our lives.
No, we weren't. And it was funny because we met and obviously it was the most beautiful sunny day. And I, as I say, I hadn't been to that part of Cornwall before. And it was so beautiful. And I thought, why am I coming here to walk in the dark? I would see this beautiful place. But no, I'm really glad I did. And obviously I will come back, but in the daylight. But no, it was an incredible experience.
It really was. And I think one of the things that I remember you saying when, when you put this idea to me was that you were interested in the edges of our fear and the edges of the wild. So I'm interested to know why those things interest you and where you noticed them on our walk together.
Mm. Yeah, so I think the edge thing is sort of a really important sort of part of who I am, I guess. Like I've always felt comfortable in who I am and what I offer and what I am in the world. So I've often felt like, and if you do it physically, dear listener, and sit on the side of your chair or the edge of something or stand on the edges of your feet, you're invited to think and feel differently. And in doing so, you consider how your bum feels in the crack, or how you're sitting slightly lopsided, or how your body is holding up a different part of yourself. And in inviting myself to think about sitting on that edge or being in that edge, I'm looking at how I'm holding myself. I'm looking at what I'm thinking. I'm considering how I'm showing up. And I'm sort of opening my circle of comfort. So there's this idea that, you know, you have your comfort zone and you have your risk zone and you have your panic zone. And I think during lockdown, and maybe during, you know, running my theatre company as well to an extent, I was in a comfort zone of, and as I had a baby, and you know, my comfort zone got smaller, and quite physically as well. I didn't go out that much. I had a bit of postnatal depression. You know, it was not a great time for kind of pushing one's, and you know, maybe having a baby is enough of a risky zone to do that. But so I think when, as he started to get older, I kind of wanted to expand my comfort zone, and how to do that felt like, well, you've got to go to the edge of your comfort zone. What is the edge? And so walking at night for me is one of those edges where, as a woman, especially walking at night in a city, you know, I'm pushed to that edge of comfort. Like, what can I feel? What can I see? How do I hold myself in these environments? And the more I have done it, the more my risk zone has got further away and my comfort has embraced. And you know, when we were walking, you know, there was this moment where, you know, the sun had set behind us, hadn't it? Oh no, was the sun was behind us. So there was, and we were walking into the darkness. And so there was this, you know, the stars started to come out. And so you immediately sort of feel the sort of magic of the time. But then as we're walking, the sides of the path are tall and high, and you can't really see through the bracken and things like that. But there's a sea down there, you know there's a sea because you can hear it. And you don't really know what's coming along the path, if there's anything. And there might be creatures and things. And so your ability to see and hear and feel is so heightened at that point. And that, again, I love, because I don't take it for granted. You don't just walk along like you're walking along the road in daylight. You're walking on the edge. And that feels to me a really live place to be, because then you can have a sense of who you are in those moments. And, you know, we opened up a conversation that was so powerfully moving about how we both feel about fear. And you know, when you're in those places where you feel on the edge, talking about fear and things becomes a really important way to sort of engage in what we're frightened of and what actually is the truth of that fear, and how can we unpick the truth of that so that the fear goes to the edge of our risk zone again. And I think there was this amazing moment where it was properly dark, and we were kind of coming up to this headland, and you know, we hadn't really seen anyone. We'd seen a few people earlier in the day, but in the night even. But we were coming round, and we could see the sea, and there was something in the distance, and I couldn't quite tell if it was a gate or whatever, but there was a sound of the gate opening and closing. And I don't know if you'd heard it, but
I'd heard it, but I was completely oblivious to what the implications of that were. I assumed it was just a gate banging in the wind, and so I was oblivious.
So I had heard it, and it wasn't that windy, so figured that someone had come through the gate. And so, you know, but there was this sort of like an acknowledgement that this could be a frightening thing, but it was at the same time, it was like, we're here together, it's fine. And so I just shouted, hello, how are you? As if I could see whatever or whoever it was coming out of the darkness. And before we knew it, there was this young lad, you know, walking past us with his massive fishing rod, and we had a lovely conversation. And it was just this wonderful idea that, you know, there's no monsters really, and you know, the chances are at that sort of time of night you're going to really come across something terrifying. You're probably more terrifying, you know. And it's so yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, he'd been fishing, so he had quite a sensible explanation for why he was on the coast path at night. When we explained that we were just going for a walk, I think he must have thought we were slightly mad.
I think he did, and then we said, yeah, and now we're going to the pub, and then that made him.
That all made sense to him, despite the fact the nearest pub was some miles away at that point.
Exactly that. How was it for you? I mean, why did you say yes?
I think because part of the reason for writing the book was to challenge myself. The walk in itself is a challenge, physically, psychologically, for the bits I've done on my own. And I think one of the things I tried and failed to do with the bioleadership was a solo, which is where you go and camp overnight on your own, kind of out of shouting distance from the other people also doing solos. And the idea is that you spend time kind of very much on your own in nature. A lot of people choose to fast so that their senses are kind of heightened. And the night when we tried to do it, a group of us went, and the idea was we'd camp together on the first night and do our solos on the second night. On the first night, some lads came into where we were camping, kind of messed about with people's tent zips, flashed torches into people's tents. Luckily, I wasn't one of the people that they did that to. I had had a almost zero sleep. I was very new to camping at the time, tent camping. And the next morning around the campfire, when the people running the retreat had explained that this had happened, we each had the opportunity to go around the circle and just express how we felt about doing that night solo, with no judgment, no response. Just that idea of when you kind of hold a circle, the idea is each person just speaks. And some people were absolutely fine, didn't bother them at all, very happy to go ahead with the next night solo. I remember one girl in particular was like, I could take them. One person said, yeah, no, I'm not doing it. Like the rest of you do what you want, but I'm out. And when it came to my turn, I just burst into tears because I think it made real my fears. And I think it's like that thing when they ask a woman if they'd rather meet a bear or a man in the woods. And I think a man was my fear. And these young men had come into our camp and they hadn't really done any harm. I think it was hijinks and they just wanted to spook people a little bit. But it was that kind of that idea that a tent will keep you safe, which is of course nonsense. It's an incredibly flimsy structure, but there's this kind of sense that it's surrounding you and it's somehow separating you from the wild outside. It really showed that idea up to be a falsity, and I was really scared. And what was beautiful is one of the people on that retreat, once everyone had spoken, sort of said, look, I think we've got some very different feelings around the room or around the fire. And I thought she was going to say, so let's take a vote. And what she actually said was, I think we need to look after the people who are the most scared. And it was just, I was so shocked. I'd just never been in a situation. I was like, well, I'm going to have to tough up and be as brave as the average braveness, you know? But actually, that would have made no sense because the people who were completely comfortable to do it, had done solos before, would do solos again. It made no difference to them if we did. I mean, it made some difference, but the impact it had on the people who wanted to do it and didn't get to do it was disproportionate to the impact on the people who were really scared. So we didn't do it. And so I think that was one of the big things I wanted to achieve on my bioleadership journey, was this solo, and I didn't. So when you said, shall we do this walk in the dark, that felt like a way to take a step towards that, to push myself a little bit, to find my edge. And actually, I didn't find it frightening at all. I think because I was with you and you had, I mean, as I said, I didn't even realize someone had come through that gate. But I think every time we saw a little light in the distance, you'd point it out to me and just say, that could be somebody, just so you know, that could be something. I think I had a lot of faith in your skill to navigate us through that situation. I was conscious that I was doing the literal navigation because that is a part of Cornwall I'm very familiar with. We were coming into Gwithian, which is my nearest beach, but trying to do it without any of my usual visual clues was really interesting. We could just about see the lights of St Ives across the water. We could see the light of the lighthouse, but trying to relate that to the feeling of the ground beneath our feet and the kind of slight shadows we could see. Frustratingly, it was a full moon, but the moon hadn't risen yet, so we didn't have that navigational aid, or that light source even. But yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I found it really interesting, as you say, how when you can't rely on your sight, your other senses are so much more heightened. Even just the feel of what we were walking over, it was like, is this mud? Is this straw? Is this gravel? Um, but yeah, it was really a really beautiful experience, and I'm very glad I did it.
I'm so glad you did too. And I think it is that thing, like there is always this, this sense often within the sort of nature connection world that you have to go out and do these terrifying things in order to connect with nature. But I really push against that, because I think again it's about establishing what your comfort zone is and how to push against that, rather than go out and do something that you ultimately find terrifying, because all you're doing is meeting your fear. You might
Mm,
overcome it, but you're just not going to be overcoming it in a way that is going to make you appreciate nature necessarily.
yeah.
You're just going to be like, I haven't slept, I'm very grumpy, and I'm hungry.
Yeah, and I
And
think there are real risks for women and people of
yeah,
color and non-binary folks and
yeah.
trans people and, all sorts of marginalized communities. I
Mm,
think a lot of the narratives about connecting with nature have been written by able-bodied straight white men.
yeah,
And there are
yeah,
genuine risks. There was a report of somebody being raped on that stretch of coastline,
yeah,
which I was aware of, when I was agreeing to this walk, and that was in broad daylight.
yeah.
So, um,
I think that's it. And I guess for me, and I think definitely coming at it from an angle as a woman, that doing something that, yeah, pushes your comfort zone, meets a risk in a way, but enables you to do it joyfully, and where
mm,
you learn something about yourself, but you also are able to take someone with you, or to take a few people. Like I've done a number of night walks in London where I've started taking a few groups, and it's been such a wonderful experience, because you can walk on your own, you can walk with someone, you can sort of, everyone walks at a different pace. So you kind of have this sort of walking alone experience, but you also have this opportunity to share with others if you want to.
yeah,
And there's something really I think really amazing about being in community
yeah,
in
yeah.
an unusual situation, whereas, you know obviously I think, and I've had the opportunity to do solos now and have enjoyed them very much, but I would also say that doing some sort of nature connection activity in community has given me more.
Mm. And actually, the bio leadership does provide that community. I remember somebody who was with us the year I went had done the same thing the year before, and it had been her first one. And she had said to Ella, one of the founders who's been on the podcast before, can I be within shouting distance of you? Like, I don't want to be able to see you. I want to pretend to myself that this is solo. But if I yell, I need to know you can hear me. And so they set up their tents so that this person had that sort of backup, that she knew if she yelled, not even screamed, but yelled, that Ella was within earshot. And so that just
Mm,
enabled her to stretch her comfort zone a little bit. If I can't see anybody, this feels solo, but I know I've got that's
yeah,
like backup. And I think organizations like the Bio Leadership Fellowship are really good at that,
absolutely.
at kind of
Yeah, yeah,
enabling people to work out where the edge of their comfort zone is with this stuff.
yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah.
Amazing. So another community project that you've done recently is called What Happens Next, for which you
Mm.
left a desk, a notebook, and a pen in Oxford's botanical gardens for a week and asked people to take a seat and pick up the story where the person before them had left off. Could you tell us more about that project?
Yeah, so it started life on a sculpture trail last year, actually, in Norfolk, which is where I grew up. And there's this amazing place called Rabningham, and it has a sculpture trail once a year. And I've gone there all my life, and it's one of these magical sort of old woodlands and old farmhouse, and they sell antiques and rugs and things like that. And then over the summer, this sort of artistic community take over, and they install various sculptures and things like that that you can wander around. And the call out last year was mythos and the stories that we tell ourselves. And so I submitted this idea to create a desk, a storytelling desk that invited uh, participants to come and just write, like the game of consequences, what happens next to whatever anyone had put before. And I worked with the composer Isa Suarez, who's a dear friend of mine and an amazing collaborator, to create a beautiful sort of audio soundscape And interestingly, there's a number of bioleadership fellows who have gifted me their voices. And in many different languages, you hear the invitation of welcome storyteller. We've been waiting for you. What happens next?
Nice.
And so you find this desk, and this desk is covered in graffiti. It starts out quite covered, but by the end of the stay, wherever it is located, it becomes more covered. And there's this leather-bound book, and you come and you sit, and you're invited to read the story that's gone before and add to it. And so it was in Norfolk, in this one location for 6 weeks, and then in another location closer to the coast for another 6 weeks. And then it's just spent a week in Oxford. And this project has been born out of my real belief that we need community, and we need to be able to listen to each other, and we need to be able to trust each other in order to progress or move forward within the world that we're living in. And I also believe that stories are the answer to that in the way that we tell them together. And so with this project, the invitation is to access your own personal creativity. So think in an imaginative way what might happen. To be courageous or brave in your response. So don't just ignore what's happened before, but pick up what's happened before and try something, see where it might go next. And then there's this request to be trusting in who comes next. And by inviting trust, you're saying, I trust that this story will carry on without me. And I've offered my part. And so the idea is lovely. And it's a lovely idea to imagine a community where you can just go and, oh, yes, someone's written about monkeys and porpoises, and I'm going to carry on this. The reality is it doesn't work like that. You know, we live in a society where people don't read instructions or don't necessarily feel that they can be creative in a way that someone else has been, or don't like what has been written before, or have a very clear idea of what they want to write. To hell with what everyone else has written. And so what you find is this amazing work of art, which is a book full of flow and ebb and full stops and pickups and Terry was here and a penis there, you know, like, and it is a beautiful sort of reality of our situation. And also what's been wonderful, so in Oxford, I decided to push it a little bit because it's been part of the Right Here, Right Now climate summit, which took over Oxford, the city of Oxford University. And so I wondered if there was these great environmental and social justice thinkers in the city, maybe they would come across my book, and maybe they would come across the story, and maybe they could contribute in some way. So the story starts, and I always start the story, and this one started in the city of Oxford in a time not unlike our own, where a terrible curse had taken over the land, and flooding and droughts had caused everyone to sort of meet a despair that they couldn't get out of. And yet a group of unlikely people came together to find a way through. And this is the story of that. So then we start this story. And you know what was amazing about it was there was these amazing moments of flow where they came up with such wonderful ideas and beauty and magic. And what you will hear when I do record it, because what I do is I digitize all the pages and then I record them as well, so you have this audio story that you can listen to, is that you will hear some powerful answers to how Oxford in the future overcomes these terrible situations. So yeah, you'll have to wait and see what happens next. But
amazing.
There is a proper story there, and you know, I take my hat off to anyone who sits at that desk and offers something in response to what someone else has put, because it's so hard. Yeah. But you know, we have to do that every day, and the more we practice that, the more we go, okay, I can see where you're going with this, let me take it somewhere further.
Yeah. It's that yes and that you mentioned earlier, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's, you know, coming from a drama background, theatre background, improv background, you know, the yes and is the most important thing one can say. And you know, I'm obviously surprised when people don't, and people don't have that ability. And it's, you know, I've always done that. And yeah, the more people that can try it, the more they will enjoy it, I think.
So anybody who's not from a drama improv background, would you mind just explaining where the yes and comes from?
The yes and, yes, absolutely. So Pick a scenario. Tell me what you had for breakfast.
I had a smoothie and a hard-boiled egg and Marmite on toast.
Yes, you had a smoothie and a hard-boiled egg and Marmite on toast, and you had a glass of champagne because you were celebrating. What were you celebrating?
Oh, this sounds more fun than my actual morning. I was celebrating the end of walking the Cornish Celtic Way.
Yes, you were celebrating the end of the Cornish Celtic Way, and the amazing situation that happened when you got to that end point. What happened?
What happened was I opened a bottle of champagne, the cork flew off, bounced against a wall, and was caught by a seagull. This is a
Yes,
true story.
and the seagull then flew off and took that cork and threw it into the mouth of the waiting dolphin that was in the sea. And the dolphin cried with joy because finally they'd got the final cork put into their cork puzzle that they were building under the sea. So that's an example of a yes and story.
This is the most amazing children's book already. But why is it important? Why is yes and more important than no but?
Okay, let's start again. What did you have for breakfast, Katie?
I had a smoothie and Marmite on toast and a hard-boiled egg.
No, I think you had muesli.
Oh, no, I definitely didn't have muesli.
It doesn't go anywhere, right?
but yeah, you could even
It
hear it in
doesn't.
my voice, couldn't you? And immediately went, but what? No, but
It stops you, and the joy of the yes and is that you both dream together, right? And so by dreaming together, you're taking a story that actually did happen, listeners. This did happen to Katie. The seagull did steal the cork.
that
But
part was true.
there is this sense that you can build on a dream together, visualize, imagine, and that's what we need right now, a shared dream, a collective imagining that isn't yes, but there's a rapist in the dark, and yes, but there's terrible teenagers out there, yes, and there's this, but it's no, yes, and let's go into the darkness, because what we will discover is magic. What we will see is starlight. What we will see is a pub at the end with our friends in it. What we will see, it's all of that. And I think the more we believe in those stories and hear those stories and try them out, tell them ourselves, the better.
Yeah, and I think that when you said at the beginning that how I responded to you was yes, and my and was partly putting a boundary in place. Like I'm comfortable to do this as long as we do the first bit in the light, because it was very steep and very close to the edge. And so I think that's also an interesting, in terms of how we bring this into our everyday life. We can say yes to things whilst keeping ourselves safe, right?
Absolutely. And then it's required of me to go, yes, and
Yeah,
let's meet in the daylight, and then let's walk to 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock before the pub shuts, and then you're
yeah,
like, yes, and I know the pub that we'll go to, and yes, let's, and by being the positive support network to our story, we we establish a clear route together.
yeah,
It's not just
yeah.
mine, it's yours as well.
Yes, yeah, and vice versa. It wasn't just mine. It became yours as well, and so much more special for it. So you mentioned when you were talking about the project in Oxford, bravery and trust, and you asked people to show up for that project with the same values that you suggest we all need to grow in uncertain times, and those are curiosity, creativity, bravery, and trust. Why are those values important for that project, but also for all of us as we navigate these uncertain times?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are the sort of foundations of how I play and how I guess they are what every child has
Mm,
and what I would seek to nurture in every child, I suppose. And I think the offer to an adult is to reconnect with your childish sense of curiosity and your childish sense of creativity and your childish sense of, yes, I can do this. I will give it a go. I will try. And then your childish sense of trust. And, with trust comes this idea of love, because you can't, you know, not love something you trust. And
mm.
so I feel like those are the things that I stand for in every aspect of the work that I make. But also I see it, and I do a day a week of a sort of general management and fundraising and producing at the Adventure Playground where my son goes to school, and I see it every day in those children there. And so I want to bring it to the adult world as well, and also to the, to the community world. It's not, and I really don't feel like we need to fit into a binary of age or anything like that. These are things we need throughout our life.
Yeah. And you talk about your work as being community focused, and that word community has come up a few times already, and also in the long grass. I'd love to know what you mean by that.
I've been thinking about how to explain this a little bit better. And so I'm going to sort of paint you a picture or a terrible storytelling metaphor. But there is this idea, I guess, that you've got this, manicured lawn. And at the end of the lawn is the big white house. The bastion of power exists there. And I don't want to be there. I want to be in the edges, in the verges, in the long grass, off that manicured lawn. I don't feel welcome there. I don't feel like I can be my best, most curious, creative, brave self there. I feel that I will find the people I want to trust in the long grass. And so that's where I choose to make my work. And I think, if we imagine that lawn and that house is the establishment, I don't think I'm anti-establishment. I'm not. Again, I don't really talk in binaries. I find that really boring, and I find it really divisive. And actually, those bastions of power, those people that live in the White House, they're welcome into the long grass, and as much as they might say, well, you're welcome on the manicured lawn, and I'm like, well, let's just let the lawn grow a little bit and all live in the long grass. So I feel like there's this sort of sense that everyone will end up in the long grass eventually. I mean, that's my hopeful belief. But actually, there's more fun to be had there because you're not striving to be perfect. You are, and listening to one of your other podcasters, you're C plus, and it's great to be that,
Yeah.
and in that way, you're all welcome. No one lives above the grass.
Yeah, yeah, that was the episode with Jolie Kapaka, and it's so funny because Jolie works specifically with what they describe as former A plus students. And Jolie's also my coach, and we had a really interesting conversation when I realized that when I'm parking my car, my ambition is not to be within the white lines. My ambition is to be exactly parallel to the white lines with the exact same amount of space on either side of my car and front of back of my car, which is because I'm trying to A plus it, right? I want to get an A plus for parking, and it's totally unnecessary as long as I'm within the white lines. C plus effort. And I do think it makes you, parking aside, take more risks, because if you have to get an A plus for everything, there's an awful lot of stuff you're not going to try. Whereas if
Well,
you can get a C plus for something, then you're more likely to try.
I think you're more likely to be more creative, more
Yeah,
curious.
yeah.
Because it's like, and also, but I think where I've often struggled is with the trust that will be met well. Because society wants us to be on the manicured lawn getting our A pluses and striving for the big white house, and I have never been that person, and I've always struggled academically. I did very badly. I went to a massive comprehensive and sort of just got completely lost within the system. And the only woman who found me, thank God, is my drama teacher. And, the rest is history. And, I still admire her hugely. And she's a massive influence in my life because, there was someone that said, yeah, no, C plus is fine, but go off and be as creative and as curious as you can, because that's where you'll thrive. And, and it's not for everybody. And I'm not, there's no shade to the A pluses in the world. Thank God for you too, because otherwise our world wouldn't function probably, or maybe it would. I don't know, but
Yeah, what happens if it's all long grass and all C plus?
Yeah, I think people would have more rest. There'd be more time for dreaming. There'd be, time for talking, storytelling, singing. I don't know. I mean, it's a utopia, but
It's interesting to think about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So I can't think of a neat segue into this question, Sophie, but the next thing I would love to talk to you about is your film Climate Criminals, and we will pop a link in the show notes so that folks can go and watch it if they haven't seen it already. But tell us a little bit about that film. Set the scene for us before I dive in more detail.
I'll do your segue for you. So these are, A plus students who are young people who are some of whom are currently in prison for doing actions in order to raise awareness of the climate crisis. And so this film came about because I, I had seen a lot of these actions on the news. I had read reports about how these terrible individuals had done terrible things to artwork or terrible things to precious monuments like Stonehenge. And yet, a good friend of mine and a collaborator that I've worked with a lot, the environmentalist Jonathan Porritt, was coming to me saying the only thing we can do now is direct actions. That's the only thing we can do to raise awareness of the climate crisis. And if
Can you, Sophie, just explain what direct action is for anybody who hasn't heard that term?
Yeah, so direct action is when you stage a protest that has some sort of action within it. So that might be throwing soup at Van Gogh. That might be
a bit like when the suffragettes decided to start breaking windows.
Yep. Well, yeah. So that is a different. So there's different versions of that. Okay. So there's something called non-violent direct action, which is something that doesn't involve a violent action, and violence can include against humans or property.
Okay.
And then there is actions which can also include actions against property as well. And so there's various different levels of action that you can take and that people have taken. And what is happening now, and what Jonathan was telling me back in January, March 2024, around my kitchen table with my colleague Becky Birchall from Change Festival, was that people are standing up for the planet and for humanity and are being about to be put in prison for it. And that these young people, often some of the brightest minds that we will come across, are being blamed for these actions rather than being heard for why they're doing it.
Well, this is because of a specific piece of legislation.
Exactly. So this has come about because there has been a change in the law to say that you cannot use the climate crisis as a defense, and you cannot, if you choose to represent yourself, mention the climate crisis in court.
Right. So we've got people taking direct action as a way to raise awareness about the climate crisis because they believe, well, because that is a threat to humanity. And so they're trying to raise awareness of that by doing things like throwing soup at paintings, which looks dramatic, but doesn't actually damage the paintings, right? Because they are framed and protected. And when they're taken to court to justify their behaviour, they're not allowed to mention the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And so when I think it was Anna and Phoebe were in court, oh no, it might have been a different, well, there's been many trials, but often there was one particular one that I heard about where the judge had to stop the court proceedings because it was too hot in the courtroom. It's things like that where, but we're not hearing about these stories, I suppose. And so back to why I made this film and the reason it's called Climate Criminals. So I'd obviously heard about these actions, but I'd seen them in the news and I'd read about them in various social media posts and stuff. But I was quite appalled by them, actually, if I'm honest. I was kind of like, they're quite shocking. And I knew, they were divisive in the way that they, got public opinion and public debate going. And when Jonathan, someone who I deeply respect, is saying these people have got it right, these people are the ones who are, putting their lives on the line to do this. And did you know? So not only are they doing these actions, but now they're going to be put in prison, and some of them are going to have seriously chunky prison sentences. And it's going to affect our right to protest across the board. So even if you want to go now to Whitehall and protest, you're not going to be able to, because there's going to be, there's going to be various lawsuits against the opportunity to protest. So I felt like the one thing that we could do was to get these people who'd done some of these actions and get their voices heard in a way that would reach beyond the headlines and reach beyond social media and invite people to see the real them. Who actually are these people? Are they just anarchists? Are they, anti-establishment ne'er-do-wells that, are just going to cause trouble, whatever? What's their background? Why have they chosen to risk their life to do this? And so we were given an opportunity to host a residency, a storytelling residency at Sheepdrove, which is an organic farm in Oxfordshire. And Becky and I were going to host this with Jonathan, and Becky and I come from a very emergent practice, and something that we've been really striving for is not to know what the outcome is. We just want to welcome them, meet them, give them a bit of time out of their really hectic lives. A lot of them were at university. We also wanted to have a cross-generational mix of people in the room as well, to sort of hear stories from people that had been doing it for a long time, as well as people that had just started. And so we got 12 people together. It was a bit like herding cats. They're all very busy, hard to contact, hard to get to in a room, but they all wanted to come. And those that could come and who weren't in prison or weren't on bail or weren't awaiting legal proceedings turned up. And we had 12 of them arrive. And I was nervous, because I didn't know who I was going to meet. I didn't know if they were going to like me, whether I was going to be sort of welcomed, because I'm not someone who can, I can't get arrested. I've got a kid. I'm the maid carer for my son. Like, I don't have that. I work with children. I can't, get a criminal record. So I didn't feel like I could, would I be seen as one of them? Would they be resistant? And also I wanted to film them, and I wanted to sort of have an audio recording as well of our conversation, so that if anything did emerge from it that we might be able to use as a film, then I wanted that to be possible. And so obviously we sat around in this first circle, and what was sort of emerging from all of them was this absolute trust, courage, and love. And it was just this sort of mind-blowing experience to sit around a room of quiet, respectful, kind. I mean, I get emotional thinking about it, because they are doing this for us, and they are willing to change the course of their lives, put the idea of having children on hold, put the idea of, having a career, whatever, on hold for us, to raise awareness of this crisis. And so it was deeply moving. And they talked a lot about community. They talked about this idea of this beloved community, where by dint of striving for this beloved community, and I think it's a term that Martin Luther King coined in the civil rights movement, that by striving for it together, you are creating it. And that's what I felt when I was in the room with them. And so the film emerged out of a number of interviews and conversations that they had in a very open way, very authentic, not them soapboxing. It was always the invitation to turn up as an individual. We didn't want them to turn up as just Off Oil or Youth Demand or any of the groups that they're part of, because we know that those groups are them. That they are turning up as themselves. So that was the invitation. And so what you see in the film is a number of them talking about their experience, what they did, why they did it, and more crucially, what they want from the world, and what the world could be, and the community that they've created. And then, of course, you have the flip in the film where you see their actions, but you also know through the storytelling that, yes, no harm was done. You see the theatre that has been created. And then you are then invited to question who the real criminals are, and to consider who is still extracting oil and gas, which governments are still granting licenses, which companies are still determined to put profit before people and planet. And that's all I wanted to do with the film, really, was to sort of give these people voice, require people to consider the story far deeper than the headlines that we've been offered. And to then, place that question in the audience, is who are the real climate criminals, and what are we going to do about it?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting, because one of the things, before I'd seen the film, before we'd had any of these conversations, you said somewhere that the creative process is more important than the outcome, than the finished story. And I was just like, I don't get that. Like, of course it's not. Surely the story, the film, the outcome is the most important thing. But I think this film is a really beautiful example of where actually that process was more important than the outcome. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about it, actually, and I hold to it more strongly than ever, because I guess for me, there are no endings. There's not a project, there's not an end to a project. And that opportunity for those people to come together and spend a bit of time thinking about what they've done, journaling. We did a number of we did a night walk. We did, we ate together. We spent time together. It was a gift for them. Anna, who was part of that, then went to prison. And she's only just come off the tag that she was put on when she came out of prison. These are massive milestones in these people's lives. So to ask them to come and sit with us was so important. And, they generously gave their time, but I think they also received quite a lot. And then since then, we've done talks, we've written articles together, and as poetry has been in various things, we've hosted screenings together, so that it's not just Becky and I, but it's also the activists themselves turning up and sharing their stories. And in doing that, the story carries on. There's no ending, and that is part of the process. So we were at the Right Here Right Now festival last week, hosting a screening. These stories we gift out to the audience and invite them to take them with them, to go and tell their friends, to talk about it, to tell their version of the story that they've heard, so that then the ripples and the impact of the process of creation is far greater than a 15-minute film, you know. And
what has the response been like when you've been touring it this year?
It's been really, really positive and really interesting and really thought-provoking. And we invite people at the very beginning, and again, it's about how we set the scene. We invite people often to sit with a herb, like I am sat with mine, and smell it and be present, to think about who they are, why they're there, what they're carrying with them, just to be alive to what's occurring in them before they watch the film and before they hear the stories from the activists. So that there's this idea that you're turning up as a human too. And to take off your hat. You're not a journalist, you're not a scientist, you're not this or that. You are just a human as well, and you're here to listen to a story. And by the end, the invitation at the end is just to be in the space with us. So there's no Q&A. You don't have to put your hand up, because we all know the people that put their hands up, right? Like, it's just be in a space, and if you want to come and talk to us and be human about it. And in that invitation, we've just found people really getting very moved and very emotional about it, and saying, I really struggle with what you do, but at the same time I really understand why you do it now. And that's
holding that nuance is, I might disagree with it, but I get it. And that, I think that nuance is so lacking in social media and mainstream media.
Yes. Yeah, we don't have time for nuance. We're too busy letting AI take over our jobs, like maybe that's what AI will gift us, is more time to be nuanced about our approach to.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because I saw somebody respond, I can't remember which painting it was, but he responded very angrily, saying that painting should be around for my great-great-grandchildren to see. Completely missing out on the irony that there will be no great-great-great-grandchildren unless we sort the climate crisis out, and that means divesting from fossil fuels.
Yes, I hope he goes and he's very angry at that big wave that will come and engulf that painting eventually.
And, it's the same thing of the courtroom being so hot, they had to adjourn proceedings, and nobody making the connection that, these unprecedented high temperatures are being caused by climate change. It's an interesting one. And I think one of the things that I'm playing with, I have friends and family members with very different values and opinions to mine on climate and things beyond climate that intersect with climate. And I guess one of the questions I had for you is, how do we take care of ourselves and each other when our opinions and our values, A, seem to be diverging, and B, seem to be more closely hewn to our identities than ever before? Kind of where we stand on certain issues seems to have become part of who we are.
Yeah, I hear that, and I see it often. And I mean, it comes to this idea of meeting the grief and seeking the joy. And I am going to be witnessing somebody say something that I disagree with, And so the invitation is always to meet the grief in me, to listen to that and to be okay about listening and offering an opportunity to hear that story. And if you're able to push back on it, great, but don't put yourself at risk, because if you get upset and you're playing into something that not that person wants, but society has asked you to play into, that you're this and they're that.
Yeah.
And we're not. None of us are this and that. We all exist in the long grass. Okay. We can all be there and meet each other. So find the connection, find the moment that you connect on something else and take it from there. And if you can then circle back to the thing that troubled you, the thing that bothered you, do it, but do it through a place of connection first. And I think that's, something that I feel, one of the biggest things is how do we listen in an age of broadcast? How do we listen? And that is my invitation always, is to listen, because often that person wants to talk it out, wants to test out what they're thinking. And in so doing, they might reflect or they might not. And, the other thing is that we can't change people's minds. They can change their minds. And so if you're able to sort of invite a way for them to be heard, brilliant. But then if there's also a way for you to find a way that you share a common ground, and then if you can then circle back to the thing that you disagreed with, but from a place of commonality, you might be able to reach them in a different way.
Yeah.
And if you can't, it's okay. Because I also think that, there's the more stories out there, the more that we're able to kind of share truth in a way, they'll come back to it. They'll have an opportunity. The fact that you've been able to say something in their vicinity is important. But I think it's about meeting them. And I had quite a difficult moment where I had to share the process of making the film on a sort of a Teams call with 500 students recently, and it was a very unsatisfactory way of talking about my process. And here I can talk to you and I can see you, and I know the audience I cannot see them here, but I trust that they are listening, and they can choose to turn off if they want to, but they are here to listen. And on this particular call, there was this, it was very hard. I couldn't see anyone. I was presenting, the sound didn't work on the films. There was this sort of, I felt discombobulated from my opportunity to be vulnerable about my process. And then someone in the chat just posted, how outrageous that you're celebrating people that ruin artworks. And so, I was grateful for the comment in a way, because it allowed me to sort of suggest that they go and investigate the truth of that comment, and to sort of investigate how truthful it is that the artworks are ruined, because I know for a fact that the artworks were put back on display, 2 hours after the event. So it's this sort of thing but I couldn't see that person, and I couldn't then talk to them after the call was over. I couldn't check in with them to see if that had any impact at all. And so you're just firing off blanks into this sort of like void, and it meant nothing to me. And it meant, it meant a lot to me, that it may not have meant anything to them. And that was something that I find really tricky about. And so that's why, when sharing the work that I make, so much of it is about creating those opportunities for community to come together, for people to come and either be on different sides of the fence or whatever, but there's this opportunity to just come and be together, because we're not always going to disagree. We're not always going to agree. We're going to always be this melting pot of humanity, as is my garden. I see the blue tits and the sparrows arguing all the time, and yet they coexist in harmony, and they get to the bird feeder eventually.
Yeah, and I think there is that idea, isn't there, that if you believe X, Y, and Z, you also believe A, B, C, and you're this type of person on both sides of any debate. And humans are more nuanced than that. We can believe certain things that technically, I'm doing air quotes, belong on this side, but also believe things that belong on the other side. And yeah, I think that we just don't have space for that complexity, do we?
No. And I think we're frightened of complexity actually as well, because in a way it's nice to box yourself. This is who I am. This is what I stand
and other
for.
people, right?
Absolutely. But I think it comes from a place where we want to put ourselves in a box first and foremost, because the minute we feel we are and there's always this thing of find your tribe, find your people, find your thing, be there, that thing. And I think I don't really subscribe to that in a way. That I feel like there is this sort of sense of just be,
Yeah.
and be accepted or not, but be yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. So the last question I ask folks, the subtitle to this podcast is Conversations About Hope. And the last question, I mean, it's kind of three questions, but the last question I always ask is, what are you hopeful about for the future? What gives you hope, and how do you hold on to that hope when it feels hard? And the phrase meeting the grief and seeking the joy, I think, is absolutely beautiful in going some way towards answering that question. But how would you wrap it up?
Yeah, so I think that is, how I meet how one chooses to meet the grief is sort of really important in terms of finding the hope, I think. And so allowing yourself to feel those feelings and journaling, being active in grief, I think is a really useful way to sort of ex,
Mm,
extract yourself from it. But it's always there, and it's always going to be there because of the world we're living in, but also because death is around the corner, and that's that's life. so grief will always be with us. It's how we choose to be in companionship with it. And if it gets too much, then it's overtaken us, and what we have to find is tools to sort of journal, to draw, to spend time outdoors, to kind of connect with the circle of life that isn't just about our lives, that is about the wider world. um and in that you will meet the joy,
mm,
because you can't help but feel joyful when the sun is shining and the birds are singing and the bees are finding the pollen for once, or that moment when the rain comes and it hasn't come for ages and you're thinking, oh my god, I felt so heavy all day, and suddenly that release of the rain. And I feel like there is so much to be joyful for in simply observing nature. But I also want to say that there is so much to be joyful for in observing us humans within nature, and finding the writers, the artists, the musicians. They are the ones that are guiding us through these times. They are the ones that are facing with curiosity and creativity, and courage and trust. And what I feel like the only other thing to sort of say is that the hope also has to extend itself to the next generation. And by believing in young people and meeting the grief of their possibility, and then finding the joy in the fact they don't give a shit and they're going to go out and do whatever they want to do anyway, and allowing that. So celebrating the spaces that hold young people and allow young people to be young people is absolutely vital. And in doing that, in being active in your hope seeking for these young people, you will find hope yourself.
beautiful. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you so much for that, for our whole conversation, for everything that you do in the world.
Well, thank you, Katie. It's been an absolute joy. And yeah, you are one of the storytellers that I feel brings the hope. So thank you.
Oh, thanks. Oh, that was a good one.
Yeah, was that all right?
That was a good one.